Hello and welcome to another episode of the History Network podcast. Usually you'd be hearing Nick, but this time out you've got me, Angus Wallace. Something a little different for you in this episode. As some of you might be aware, I also host the Ancient Warfare podcast, a monthly roundtable discussion about war in the ancient world. Last year we launched a Patreon page for the podcast, patreon.com/ancient warfare podcast. Historians aren't the best paid lot and everyone is essentially doing the podcast for free. We thought it might be a good way to help us cover costs, and if you enjoy it, to tip us $1 each time we produce a new episode. Anyway, the upshot is regular Murray Dahm has decided to read some of his old articles he's written for Ancient Warfare magazine, exclusively for patrons of the podcast. As we had a hole in our schedule, we thought you'd let you guys have a listen to the first one Murray recorded. You could be the next Alexander.
The Macedonian king and general Alexander the Great was the general to emulate in the ancient world. In the 4th century BC, Alexander invaded and conquered the vast Persian Empire, reaching Egypt in the south, India in the east, and as far north as Tajikistan. In fact, to this day, Alexander remains the benchmark of great military accomplishment. Virtually every commander and student of military history since him has pondered if they could have done what he did, and if they could be the next Alexander. Several figures in history have seen themselves as precisely that, but all have fallen short of the mark. There was, however, a way of learning how to be the next Alexander the Great in the ancient world. The genre of practical handbooks known as tactica, which revealed how to marshal Alexander's Macedonian Phalanx, were produced and read with the precise intent of enabling the reader to be the next Alexander. Although many more were written, only 3 of these treatises survive. The 3, by the authors Asclepiodotus, Aelian, and Arrian, span a period of 200 years, but the first of them wrote almost 300 years after Alexander's death. The allure of Alexander's success and the desire of many subsequent generals to emulate his accomplishments kept the impetus to write these works alive and well for centuries. These tactica came from a genre of didactic military literature, intended to inform and improve ancient generals, distilling what the commander needed to know. The earliest of them dates to the 4th century BC, and they continued to be written in an unbroken tradition until the 10th century AD under the Byzantine Empire. That's a 1400-year literary tradition, but one which is much neglected today. The aspect of ancient generalship which they illustrate is also one which does not garner much attention. The authors of Tactica explicitly claimed that through reading their works you could be the next Alexander. Yeah, right, I hear you all cry. The idea that generalship can be taught using handbooks poses important questions for the military historian. So, let's have a look at these Tactica and see what we might be able to get out of them. Try to understand why they continued to be written and continued to make the claims of practicality for hundreds of years after Alexander's death. The first surprising thing about Tactica is that our 3 surviving examples were all written for a Roman audience. Asclepiodotus was a Stoic philosopher writing in Rome around the 50s BC. Aelian, another man with no known military career, wrote for the Emperor Trajan just before his Parthian campaign in approximately 113 AD. The last surviving author is Arrian, whose treatise dates to AD 136 or 137. Arrian is, of course, most famous for his history of Alexander the Great, the Anabasis, one of the best sources for Alexander's career to have survived. All 3 Tactica are very similar, and it is likely that they come from the same source or copied earlier works. That source is possibly the historian Polybius, who included a similar description of the phalanx in his histories, but who also wrote a Tactica itself, which does not survive. The dates of these 3 surviving tactica, which claimed to teach the tactics of Alexander and his Macedonian phalanx, seem strange to say the least. The Macedonian phalanx had long since been superseded by the Roman legion, and the Roman legions had defeated the inheritors of Alexander's phalanx in the 2nd century BC. Tactica treatises had a long tradition, however, which stretched back to Alexander himself, and his memory was important to any general. It is also not surprising to find Romans turning to the tactics of Alexander when we remember that his enemy, the Achaemenid Persians, were considered synonymous with one of Rome's most implacable foes, the Parthians. And the fact was, Rome was never as successful against the Parthians as Alexander had been against the Persians. A successful campaign against the Parthians could well and truly set up a comparison between a Roman commander and Alexander. Roman generals knew the value of such a comparison, and many attempted Parthian conquest so that they could be considered an Alexander. Nearly all of those Roman generals learned to their great cost just how difficult being the next Alexander was. Roman success against the Parthians was rare, and victory and conquest on the scale of Alexander's proved impossible. The importance of Alexander was not lost on the writers contemporary to these Roman generals, and many of them sought patronage and favour by contributing their expertise so that Roman generals and emperors could be the next Alexander. Authors' main tool in displaying their expertise was by writing tactica. Parthia was the hot enemy in the late 50s BC. They had defeated the Roman general Crassus at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, inflicting one of Rome's greatest defeats. It is not surprising, therefore, to find Asclepiodotus offering a tactica at that time. Aelian also aimed his tactica at the Emperor Trajan, who was about to depart on a Parthian campaign. The irony that the Roman legions which had defeated the Macedonian phalanxes of Alexander's successors was unable to defeat the Persians/Parthians was not lost on these authors. They took every opportunity to celebrate their Greek past in the context of the Roman present. They advised that the best way for Romans to defeat these foes was to emulate Alexander's formation. Tactica describe in intricate detail how to form, arm, name, and maneuver the Macedonian phalanx of Alexander. Arrian tells us that his primary purpose was to cure ignorance of phalanx tactics. Tactica tell us that the file, lokos, of a phalanx consisted of 16 men. The file could be doubled or halved depending on circumstances, giving a depth of 8 or 32 men. The divisions of the phalanx expanded out from this. Thus, 2 files are a dilochia, 2 dilochi are a tetrarchy, 2 tetrarchies are a taxis, and 2 taxae are a syntagmata of 256 men. These expansions are potentially unending, to the point that a phalanx army consisted of 4 phalangarchies of 1,024 files, or 16,384 men. The potential confusion of names and numbers abound. The formation of the phalanx could also vary in different situations, such as compact order and lock-shield order. These orders are described as being most appropriate in different situations. Compacting is used whenever the general wishes to lead the phalanx against the enemy, locking shields when the defenders have to receive the enemy's attack. The best man and commander of the file was in the front rank, excelling the others in quality. The second best man was the file closer at the rear of the file. Thus, the best men led from the front and controlled the rear ranks as well. The best quarter of the phalanx, a phalangarchy or half-wing, was posted on the right, the second best on the left, and so on. The weakest troops were therefore stationed in the centre. 2 phalangarchies made a wing, horn, or division of the army. The Tactica also described the formations of peltasts and light infantry, psiloi, who were organized in the same way as the phalanx into files with different names for their formations. Thus far, Tactica don't seem to tell the ancient general anything they didn't already know, or that they might discover through other means. For modern military historians, there is value in discovering the exact formational capabilities of the phalanx, but there certainly doesn't seem to be any secrets about being the next Alexander contained in such information. At the same time, it is clear some commanders in antiquity did not know this information, and, more importantly, they considered that they should know it. Tactica cavalry formations, sometimes including elephants and chariots, included heavy cavalry or cataphracts, spear cavalry, and missile cavalry. These were drawn up in squares, oblong rectangles, rhombuses, or wedges, half a rhombus. A squadron, or ile, could contain 36 or 64 horsemen, and divisions continue up to the epitagma of 4,096 horsemen. Tactica also include orders and formations. These include turnings, about face, quarter turn, half turn, and countermarches, the Macedonian, the Persian, and the Laconian, and were used to align the formations of the phalanx in different ways in different combat situations. For instance, countermarches by rank are made when we want the extreme wings to exchange positions with the half wings and the half wings with the extreme wings for the purpose of strengthening the middle of the formation. Turns to the left are shieldward, and those to the right are spearward. Formations include a refused flank involving an oblique formation in which one wing, whichever is chosen beforehand, is advanced against the enemy and alone does the fighting, while the other is held back in reserve. On occasion, we know that these very formations or orders were issued during ancient battles. The refused wing formation was, for instance, drawn up by Alexander's father Philip at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, and by Alexander himself at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC. Orders could be issued with vocal commands or flag signals and given to a single syntagma, part or all of the phalanx. Orders were carried out by syntagma. Some of these orders are obvious, such as forward march and halt. Others are far more technical. No orders are recorded in Tactica for the speed of advance, although from other contexts we know that such orders must have been possible. Tactica stressed the need for the men of the phalanx to be silent so that they could hear their orders clearly. They also stressed the need for the men to be familiar with their orders so that they could carry them out instantly. Orders also needed to be issued by the commander as unambiguously as possible. Thus, an order to make a half turn to the right would be spearward half turn. The need to drill these formations are stressed by Tactica, and they had diagrams attached to aid understanding. Only a single medieval set of these diagrams survive. Some criticisms of these treatises are justified. They are too mathematical and seem only to be of interest to the antiquarian. They do not seem to contain any secret knowledge to being the next Alexander within their pages. And yet, they continued to be produced as such for centuries. Also, in the case of Aelian and Asclepiodotus, we are dealing with men who, as far as we know, had no practical military experience, and the charge that the writing of Tactica had fallen into the hands of mere philosophers seems valid. For these reasons, Tactica have fared particularly badly in the eyes of historians. They have been abused and derided as poor literature, and no attempt has been made to understand them in their intended practical context. This practical purpose can be found in the assurances of the authors, which close each treatise. These are, in brief, the principles of the tactician. They will bring safety to those that follow them and defeat to their opponents. Despite modern criticisms, Tactica continued to be written and received as practical handbooks in antiquity. Several historians have traced the use of phalanx tactics by Roman commanders in the legions throughout the imperial period. We know that these treatises were read and continued to be considered practical by Roman commanders and beyond. And in this context, we perhaps have a glimpse of how they could inspire a latter-day Alexander. Aelian's Tactica was first translated in 1455 and emerged as an important practical work in the 16th and 17th centuries when armies of pike phalanxes dominated European warfare. The Cretan countermarch of the Tactica specifically inspired William Louis of Nassau to invent the European countermarch for musket volley fire in the late 16th century. William Louis read Aelian's Tactica and wrote to his cousin Maurice on December the 8th, 1594, that he had found a method of allowing a continuous volley of musket fire by rotating the musketeers in emulation of the phalanx tactics of old. Maurice then implemented this revolutionary reform, which became known as the European countermarch, and musketry volleys soon became the standard battle tactics of European armies. This wide-reaching reform owes its existence to a Tactica treatise which described the Macedonian Phalanx of Alexander the Great. Thus, these handbooks, combined with experience in the field, do seem to have been of practical use and could, if used in the right way, inspire you to become a modern-day Alexander the Great.
I hope you enjoyed Murray's article. To get more of them, why not become a patron of the Ancient Warfare Podcast at patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. Not only will you get exclusive access to Murray's recordings, but also get the chance to contribute to the show when we put the call out for questions around the next topic we'll be looking at. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.